Alex, a young and aspiring writer, was always in search of the perfect spot to ignite his creativity. Tired of the constant distractions of city life, he decided to spend a weekend alone in a house deep in the woods, hoping the tranquility would help him focus on his latest project. With his laptop and a bag full of essentials, Alex set off for this retreat, eager for the peace and quiet. Upon his arrival at the house, he felt an immediate sense of relief. The stillness of the woods and the absence of city noise was exactly what he needed. He quickly settled in, taking a brief tour of the house, admiring its blend of modern and rustic charm. The study, in particular, captivated him. It was as if it was made just for him, a writer's paradise. That evening, Alex prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the solitude and the sound of the crackling fire from the fireplace. Afterwards, he made his way to the study, excited to start writing. The words flowed effortlessly in this perfect, secluded environment. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at ease, lost in his world of words and imagination. However, as the night deepened, a subtle change in the atmosphere began to take hold. The once comforting silence of the house started to feel heavier, almost charged with an unspoken anticipation. As the weekend progressed, Alex's initial sense of peace began to give way to a feeling of unease. It started with small, barely noticeable things. Sometimes he would leave his notebook on the desk, only to find it on the bookshelf later. Initially, he dismissed these occurrences as forgetfulness, but the frequency of these events started to unsettle him. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the world outside was silent, Alex would hear faint footsteps, as if someone was walking upstairs. The first few times, he convinced himself it was just the house settling, a natural occurrence in old buildings. But the footsteps seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be just random creaks and groans of the house. One evening, while engrossed in writing, Alex heard a soft thud from the living room. His heart raced as he cautiously left the study to investigate. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling that something was amiss lingered in the air. The silence of the house now felt oppressive, making Alex acutely aware of every sound, every shadow. The culmination of these strange occurrences happened one night as Alex was working late in his study. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a fleeting reflection on his computer screen, a shadowy figure standing behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the soft hum of his laptop. This incident left Alex shaken. The house, once a sanctuary of solitude, now seemed to harbor a lurking, unseen presence. The tension in the house reached its peak on Alex's final night. The odd occurrences over the past few days had frayed his nerves, yet he was determined to spend one last night in the study, trying to focus on his writing. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and charged. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the study shifted. The air felt colder, and a sense of foreboding filled the room. Alex tried to shake off the feeling and concentrate on his work, but he couldn't ignore the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if he was being watched. Suddenly, the room went cold, and the hairs on Alex's arms stood on end. He heard a faint whispering sound, but couldn't make out any words. It seemed to come from behind him, near the bookshelf. Stealing his nerves, Alex slowly turned around. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes were drawn to the reflection in the window. A shadowy figure stood behind him, just out of clear view. Frozen in place, Alex watched in horror as the figure in the reflection seemed to move closer. He wanted to run to scream, but fear rooted him to the spot. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was then that the figure in the reflection reached out towards him. In a moment of panic, Alex spun around, but there was nothing there, just the familiar empty room. He turned back to the window, and the reflection was gone. The room suddenly warmed up, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as quickly as it had descended. Alex was left standing in the middle of the room, heart racing, mind reeling. He knew he wasn't imagining things. After the terrifying encounter, Alex spent a restless night, barely sleeping. As dawn broke, he decided he couldn't leave the house without understanding what had happened. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, he began searching the house for any clues to the mysterious occurrences. Mark, a young graphic designer, had recently moved to the city for a new job opportunity. Excited but on a tight budget, he found this old apartment, which was surprisingly affordable given its size and location. Despite its age and slightly worn appearance, Mark saw potential in it and was thrilled about living on his own in the city. On moving days, he eagerly set up his space, arranging his limited furniture, setting up his workspace with his computer and design equipment, and hanging a few personal items to make the place feel like home. The apartment, with its quaint charm and quiet ambience, seemed like the perfect place for Mark to start his new life. In the first few days, Mark was busy with work and getting to know the city. He appreciated the apartment's peacefulness, a welcome contrast to the bustling city streets. It was a sanctuary where he could relax and focus on his creative projects. Initially, Mark enjoyed the solitude. He would spend evenings working on his designs or relaxing on the sofa, enjoying the stillness of the apartment. But soon he started to feel a vague sense of unease, a feeling that something was slightly off. The apartment's charm began to give way to a subtle sense of disquiet, a feeling that was hard to shake off. As days turned into weeks, Mark's initial enthusiasm about the apartment began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He started to notice small, unexplainable things that added to the apartment's eerie atmosphere. Sometimes, when he came home from work, he would find objects slightly moved from where he remembered leaving them. At first, he shrugged these incidents off as forgetfulness, but they became too frequent to ignore. The strangest thing, however, were the whispers. It began one night as Mark was drifting off to sleep. He thought he heard faint whispering sounds, like hushed voices speaking just beyond his understanding. Assuming it was his neighbors, he tried to ignore it. But night after night, the whispers continued, growing clearer and more persistent, as if trying to communicate something urgent. As the whispering grew more intense, other odd occurrences began to happen. Lights would flicker without reason, and the television would turn on by itself, displaying static before shutting off again. Mark's nights were restless, filled with strange dreams influenced by the unsettling atmosphere of the apartment. One evening when Mark was alone, working at his desk, the whispering suddenly became clearer, more insistent, as if urging him to listen. It was then that he felt a chill run down his spine. The whispers seemed to be coming from a specific part of the wall in the hallway. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Mark approached the wall. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as he pressed his ear against the cold, rough surface. What he heard next would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet old apartment. The night Mark decided to confront the whispers was one he would never forget. The voices behind the wall grew louder and more desperate as he pressed his ear against the cold surface. It was as if they were right there with him, separated only by the thin barrier of plaster and brick. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a clear, distinct plea for help. The voice, unmistakably human, sounded terrified and urgent. Mark's heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. He knew he couldn't ignore this cry for help, no matter how surreal the situation seemed. In a frenzy, Mark searched for the source of the voice. He tapped along the wall, listening for any change in the sound. To his astonishment, a section of the wall sounded hollow. Adrenaline coursing through his veins, Mark grabbed a hammer and began to chip away at the plaster. As chunks of wall fell away, an unbelievable sight was revealed. Behind the wall was a hidden room, small and cramped, its existence unknown to Mark until this moment. Inside, he found old, tattered belongings, and on the wall, desperate messages were scrawled, pleas for help that mirrored the whispers he had been hearing. Mark stood there, stunned, as the realization hit him. The apartment had a dark secret. The whispers he had been hearing were echoes of a past tragedy trapped within these walls. Someone had been confined in this hidden room, their pleas for help unheard for years until now. Overwhelmed by the discovery, Mark called the authorities. As they arrived and investigated the hidden room, the whispers slowly faded, as if the unveiling of this secret had released the trapped voices from their silent prison. After the harrowing discovery of the hidden room and its tragic past, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The authorities revealed that the room was likely a remnant from a darker time in the building's history, perhaps used for illicit purposes. Ethan, a software engineer from the city, found himself standing at the threshold of the rustic cabin he had just inherited. He was used to the relentless pace of urban life with its constant noise and activity. The cabin, with its tranquil setting and old-world charm, was a stark contrast to what he was accustomed to. He spent the first few hours exploring the cabin, taking in the quaint details of its construction and the remnants of the past that lingered in every corner. The cabin seemed frozen in time, with its antique furniture and old family pictures adorning the walls. Ethan was particularly intrigued by the small study filled with vintage radio equipment. The array of dials, wires, and antennas spoke of a bygone hobby, a window into the previous occupant's world. Ethan, with his tech background, found these relics fascinating, a stark contrast to the sleek, modern devices he worked with every day. As evening fell, Ethan settled in. He lit a fire in the stone fireplace, casting a warm glow throughout the living room. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt completely disconnected from the outside world. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan realized just how profound the silence was. It was an all-encompassing quiet, so intense that it almost had a presence of its own. Ethan tried to distract himself by tinkering with the old radios in the study. He had a knack for technology and found it fascinating to explore these vintage machines. As he fiddled with the dials and antennas, he wondered about the person who had used them before, about the distant voices they might have captured from the ether. But the more time Ethan spent in the cabin, the more he felt a sense of unease. Objects seemed to move when he wasn't looking. A book he was sure he had left on the table would appear on the shelf. A chair slightly shifted from its original position. Ethan rationalized these occurrences as lapses in his memory, but deep down he felt unsettled. One evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, Ethan's sense of unease reached a peak. The cabin felt colder, the shadows deeper. As he sat in the study, he heard a faint sound that he hadn't heard before, a distant tapping, rhythmic and persistent. It seemed to be coming from the basement. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Ethan decided to investigate. The tapping grew louder as he approached the basement door, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the rest of the cabin. With each step he took, the sound became more distinct, more urgent, leading him to a discovery that would shatter the stillness of the cabin forever. Ethan, with a sense of trepidation, opened the creaky door to the basement. The tapping sound that had drawn him here became clearer, more rhythmic. As he descended the old wooden stairs, each step echoed in the otherwise silent cabin. The air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier, as if he was moving into a different world altogether. Reaching the bottom, Ethan found himself in a dimly lit room filled with more old radio equipment, much larger and more complex than those upstairs. The tapping sound was louder here, and to his astonishment, it was coming from one of the radios. This ancient machine, covered in dust and cobwebs, was receiving a signal. Ethan approached the radio, his curiosity overcoming his fear. He carefully adjusted the dials, and the static-filled room was suddenly pierced by a clear, distinct series of beeps. It was Morse code, a method of communication long obsolete. Ethan, thanks to a childhood hobby, understood it. The message was a series of coordinates and a desperate plea for help. The realization hit Ethan like a wave. The radio was receiving a distress signal, possibly decades old. The cabin, secluded and forgotten, had been receiving these cries for help, unheard by anyone until now. Ethan felt a rush of emotions, confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. He knew he had to act. Using his phone, he looked up the coordinates. They pointed to a location not far from the cabin, deep in the forest. Despite the fear and the unknown, Ethan felt compelled to find the source of the signal. Grabbing a flashlight and his jacket, he stepped out into the cold night, determined to uncover the mystery that the cabin had been hiding all these years. Ethan's journey through the dense forest was guided only by the beam of his flashlight and the coordinates from the old radio's distress signal. The night was eerily quiet. The only sounds were his footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. After what felt like hours, he arrived at the coordinates, a clearing in the forest, but found nothing. No signs of an old camp, no remnants of a distress situation, just the silent, empty woods.